The first thing Rael Morrow noticed about the Veth-Kali warship was that it smelled like old rain. He didn't know how that was possible. He was standing in vacuum-sealed armor on the observation deck of the Cassian Gate, a human deep space relay station at the edge of the Helix corridor, and the Veth-Kali cruiser Unbroken Meridian was still 11 kilometers out, sliding toward the docking strut with the kind of slow, ancient confidence that only came from 5,000 years of naval supremacy. But somehow, through the sealed hull, through 3 centimeters of reinforced composite glass, through the recycled, processed, tasteless air of a station that had never hosted rain of any kind, he could smell it, cold, clean, the specific coldness of stone after a downpour. He'd been a captain for 11 years. He'd learned to trust the things his body told him before his brain caught up. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. Petty Officer Yenna Cascada looked up from the docking console. She was 23, sharp-eyed, and had the particular expression of someone who had learned to take Rael Morrow's premonitions seriously. "Sir? I don't know yet." He watched the cruiser drift, log it. She logged it. Timestamp: 047 station time, day 1 of the Council Summit, Cassian Gate Station, Helix Corridor, Sector 9. That log entry would later be entered into the congressional record of 7 separate planetary governments as the first documented warning before everything came apart. The Galactic Council Summit had been Rael's assignment for 6 weeks. He hadn't wanted it. His ship, the destroyer S. Morrow's Ridge. He'd named it himself, an act of profound, career-threatening vanity that his admiral had eventually chosen to find endearing, was currently sitting in dry dock at Callaway Station getting 3 new drive coils and a complete overhaul of her port weapons array, which Rael had destroyed engaging a Chellic pirate swarm in the Redgate Nebula. His crew was on rotation leave. He had nothing to do except wait and feel the particular restless agony of a combat captain with nothing to fight. So when Admiral Bren had called and said, "Morrow, I need a human face on the Cassian Gate security detail for the Council Summit," he'd said yes because saying no would have required him to keep sitting in his quarters staring at the dry dock feed, watching robots weld plates onto his ship. The summit was, in theory, a routine matter. The Galactic Council convened every 7 years at a neutral station to ratify trade agreements, settle border disputes, and remind everyone that the laws of interstellar civilization still technically applied. Humans had been full council members for 40 years. They were still the newest species in the room. They were also, at 40 years, still the only species that the Council's own security algorithms flagged as a potential destabilizing force during every single summit. Not because humans were violent, but because the algorithms had learned from experience that wherever humans appeared in large numbers, unexpected things happened. Rael had read that report. He'd found it funny at the time. He was finding it somewhat less funny now, watching the Unbroken Meridian settle into dock with a sound like a held breath finally released. The Veth-Kali were the oldest species on the Council. They looked, from a human aesthetic perspective, extraordinary, tall, luminescent, with bioluminescent patterns that shifted across their skin like slow aurora, and eyes the color of deep ocean water. They communicated in layered harmonics that required translation matrices to parse, and they moved with the deliberate grace of beings who had never, in 5 millennia of civilization, been required to hurry. They were the species that had first built the Helix Corridor transit network. They were, in several senses, the architects of the civilization that all the Council species now inhabited. They also treated humans with a polite condescension that Rael found significantly more aggravating than open hostility. He'd take open hostility. Open hostility meant someone thought you were worth fighting. The Veth-Kali delegation was led by Envoy Prime Sariel Ven, who arrived at the airlock with 12 attendants, a retinue of Council observers, and a presence so composed it seemed to bend the air around her. She was 3 meters tall. Her bioluminescent patterns were deepest blue and silver. When she inclined her head at Rael in greeting, it was the kind of nod you'd give a houseplant you'd decided, charitably, to keep alive. "Captain Morrow," she said through the translation matrix. Her actual voice was a chord, low and complex, and it resonated in Rael's chest in a way that felt both biological and slightly unsettling. "I trust the station is prepared." "Station's ready, Envoy Prime. Welcome to Cassian Gate." She looked at him for a moment with those deep ocean eyes and said nothing further, which Rael suspected was the Veth-Kali equivalent of a compliment. He fell into step behind the delegation and tried to shake the smell of old rain out of his head. The thing about Cassian Gate was its history. Most people who worked on the station didn't know it, because most people who worked on stations didn't read history. Rael had read history compulsively since he was 12, a habit that had annoyed every superior officer he'd ever had and saved his crew's lives on 4 separate occasions. Cassian Gate had been built 230 years ago, originally as a Vethkali navigational beacon. It was part of their ancient network, the Kelveris system, a chain of deep space structures that used quantum-resonant anchors buried in the station cores to keep the helix corridors, transit lanes stable. The Kelveris network was old, older than the Council, older than most of the member species' spaceflight histories. The Vethkali had built it when they were the only technologically advanced species in the arm, and they'd built it to last forever. Except that 230 years ago, during the early expansion period, the Vethkali had ceded the outer network stations to the newly formed Council as a gesture of goodwill and resource sharing. Cassian Gate had been retrofitted, expanded, modernized. Human engineers had added 8 new docking arms, a full residential section, a civilian market, and a thermal regulation system that actually kept the human quarters at a comfortable temperature instead of the near freezing standard the Vethkali preferred. But the anchor was still there, deep in the station's core. A Vethkali quantum-resonant anchor, 2,000 years old, humming away in the dark. Rael knew about it because he'd read the station's engineering manifest when he arrived. He'd noted it. He'd thought briefly that it was interesting. And then he'd gone back to his pre-summit security checklist and forgotten about it entirely. He would think about it again in approximately 16 hours, when the mountain rose from the floor. The summit opened with ceremony, because interstellar diplomacy ran on ceremony the way deep space engines ran on deuterium, constant, necessary, and if you ran out, you were stranded and everyone was going to die. Rael stood post at the council chamber entrance while 7 species worth of delegates filed in. The Chelak with their 6-limbed gait and chitinous armor. The Moranai, who were small and dense and communicated partially through scent in ways that the station's air recyclers occasionally struggled with. The Drev, who breathed methane and attended summits in sealed environmental suits that made them look like ancient deep-sea divers. The Isin, whose age was impossible to determine because they were photosynthetic and had been, as near as anyone could tell, alive in some form since before the last ice age on their home planet. And the humans, 40 years of membership noosed species in the arm, still the only ones who'd ever, during a summit recess, organized an impromptu competitive eating contest involving 17 different alien food items and turned it into a minor diplomatic incident when it emerged that one of the items was a sacred ceremonial food of the Moranai delegation. The humans had apologized. The Moranai had initially been offended, and then they'd watched footage of the contest and something in their olfactory communication had shifted, and 6 months later there was a new trade agreement. Rael didn't entirely understand how that had happened, but it was exactly the kind of thing that made the Council's security algorithms nervous about humans. He watched Ambassador Del Park take her seat at the human delegation table. She was 60, compact, with silver hair and the particular stillness of someone who had spent 3 decades in council chambers and had learned to be as patient as geological formation when required. She caught Rael's eye as she passed. He gave her the smallest possible nod. She returned it and sat down and folded her hands in front of her and waited. Rael went back to watching doors. It was the maintenance log that found him, not the other way around. 6 hours into the summit's first day, Rael was doing a final security sweep when his wrist terminal chimed with an automated flag from the station's engineering monitoring system. He almost dismissed it. Automated flags during summits were 90% false positives, but something made him open it. Core anchor unit. Resonance variance detected 0.003% deviation from baseline. He stared at 0.003% wasn't much. The kind of thing you'd file under within acceptable parameters and forget. But something about it sat wrong with him. He'd read about the Kelveris network. He'd read about what the anchors did, not in technical detail, but in enough historical context to know that they were not, according to the Vethkali engineers who designed them, supposed to deviate at all. The engineers had called them absolute stabilizers. The phrase used in the original Vethkali documentation, translated, was something closer to the thing that keeps the world from dreaming. He didn't know what that meant, but the world from dreaming was not a phrase that made him feel relaxed about a deviation. He called his engineering liaison, Lieutenant Commander Priya Solano. At 23:04, I need you to look at the core anchor, he said. Sir, it's 11 at night. I know. I need you to look at the core anchor. A pause. The log says it's within parameters. Look at it anyway. Another pause longer. The kind of pause that meant she was already getting up and finding her boots. 11 years of working with Rael Morrow had calibrated her to these requests. She didn't know why he wanted things checked. She'd learned that finding out was usually faster than arguing. Give me 20 minutes, she said. She called back in 14. Her voice was different, the careful, controlled flatness of someone choosing not to sound alarmed. Captain, the anchor is... It's doing something I don't have a reference for. The resonance pattern is changing. It looks almost like it's responding to something. Like it's, I don't know how to describe this, like it's waking up. The smell of old rain was suddenly very strong. Evacuate the core level, Rael said. Do it quietly, no alarms, tell the crew it's a routine maintenance precaution. And find me Envoy Prime Sarel Ven. Sir, it's the middle of the summit. Find her anyway. Sarel Ven received him in her quarters at midnight. This was, he would later learn, an extraordinary concession. Veth Kali did not receive anyone in their quarters, ever, under any circumstances except emergency. She met him at the threshold rather than in the room itself, which was still a concession. Her bioluminescent patterns were running in deep, slow pulses, something he'd learned to read over his 6 weeks of preparation as the Veth Kali equivalent of contained distress. She already knew. You felt it, she said. Not a question. I noticed a variance in the anchor's resonance, he said. My engineer says it's responding to something. Not something. Sarel Ven was quiet for a moment. Her bioluminescent patterns shifted, the aurora blue going briefly dark, then returning, slow and heavy. The entity is called Kelvast in our oldest tongue. There is no accurate translation. The closest approximation in your language would be something like, the dreaming beneath. Rael waited. 5,000 years ago, she said. Before we had starships, before we had the Council, before we had the Helix Corridor, we encountered it. It was drawn to our first anchor beacons, which we had built to stabilize the quantum foam of our home system. It came through the resonance field the way sound comes through walls. You cannot stop it, only redirect it. It consumed 3 of our colony worlds before we understood what it was. What is it? Kelvast is. She paused again, and this time the pause had a different quality, the quality of someone choosing between versions of the truth. It is not alive in the way we understand life. It is a structure of consciousness without body, without fixed location. It exists in the resonance spaces between quantum-anchored objects. The beacons are not just navigational tools, they are cages. Very beautiful, very precise cages. We built the entire Kelveris network not to stabilize the Helix Corridor. She looked at him directly, for the first time since he'd arrived, and her deep ocean eyes were profoundly still. We built it to keep Kelvast contained. Rael was quiet for 3 seconds. And the resonance variance, he said, means it is waking. And when it wakes, Sarel Ven's bioluminescent patterns went fully dark for a moment, just a moment. Then they came back subdued and close. In our histories, she said, the last time Kelvast was fully awake and uncontained, it unmade 6 inhabited systems, not by destroying them, by consuming what makes them real. Their inhabitants began to forget, not just information, but the experience of existing. They ceased to have identities that could be maintained. They became part of it. The way a drop of water becomes part of the ocean. She looked past him, at the wall, as though seeing something much further away. We have no record of anyone who was fully consumed by Kelvast ever returning. Those systems are empty now. We do not speak of them. How do you stop it? The anchor must be reinforced. Specifically, the resonance beacon must receive an infusion of quantum stabilizing energy from a living consciousness strongly bonded to the network. In our history, we used sacrifices. Her voice didn't change on that word. Veth Kali bound to the anchor by blood and genetics, giving their consciousness to recage it. It is not a small thing. The one who reinforces the anchor does not die precisely, but they do not remain entirely themselves. What does that mean? They become the anchor, part of them. Their consciousness is distributed into the cage, and they become another pause. One of our words for it is the one who holds the door. They can continue to exist, but they exist in a diminished way. Some have described it as living in winter when you were made for summer. Rael thought about that. There are 12 Veth Kali in your delegation, he said. Yes. How many are bound to the network? She was quiet. Her patterns moved in slow, complex shapes that the translation matrix couldn't parse. Envoy Prime, he said. 1, she said. I am the only one of my delegation who is network bound. I was sent here because this station houses the primary anchor, and it is standard protocol for a network-bound envoy to oversee summits at anchor stations. In the event of an anomaly, I would be the one to reinforce the anchor. You'd sacrifice yourself. It is the duty of the bound. Rael stood very still in the corridor outside her quarters and felt the weight of 11 years of command settle on him in a particular way. Not heavy, but specific. The weight of a decision that couldn't be undone. When? He asked. The resonance variance will reach critical threshold in approximately 31 of your hours. At that point, Kelvast will fully awaken, and containment will be impossible without a willing sacrifice. After that, she paused. After that, we have perhaps 6 hours before it begins to consume the station, and then the corridor, and then whatever is beyond the corridor. He nodded. He looked at the wall for a moment, doing what Yenna called his math face. The expression he got when he was calculating options and discarding them. I need everything you have on the anchor, he said. Technical specs, resonance protocols, everything from your engineering records on the Kelvaris network. All of it. I need it in the next 2 hours. Why? He looked at her. Because 31 hours is enough time to try something else first. She looked at him for a long moment with those deep, still eyes. Captain, she said carefully, the Kelvaris containment problem has engaged our greatest minds for 5,000 years. Every possible alternative was exhausted. The sacrifice protocol is the only solution we have found. That's because every one of those minds was Vethkali, he said. No offense. Her bioluminescent patterns did something he'd never seen before. A brief, fast flicker of gold through the blue-silver field. It was gone almost before he registered it. She turned and went into her quarters and returned 40 seconds later with a data pad that contained 5,000 years of Vethkali engineering archives. He took it and went to find Priya Solano. They worked in the engineering bay under the station's main corridor, which was off-limits to summit delegates, and therefore blissfully quiet. Rael, Priya, and senior technician Jogo Watts, who had been asleep when Rael knocked on his door and was now on his 4th cup of coffee, and who had the specific energized focus of someone who had been handed a genuinely interesting problem at 1 a.m. The Vethkali data was extraordinary. 5,000 years of engineering records, written in harmonic notation that their translation matrices could parse, but that felt, when rendered into human language, like poetry that had accidentally become physics. The anchor was not simply a machine. It was, in a meaningful sense, a living structure. It had been grown rather than built, using quantum lattice techniques that human engineering still didn't fully understand. And its containment field was maintained through a constant feed of organized consciousness, which was why a living being had to sacrifice themselves to reinforce it. The anchor needed not just energy but structured thought, intentional mind. Right, Priya said, at about 2 a.m., running her hands through her hair. So the anchor is essentially a consciousness-powered cage. And every time it's needed reinforcement for 5,000 years, the Vethkali have thrown a person into it. Yes, Rael said, and we're trying to not do that. Yes, okay. She stared at the schematics. The problem is the bandwidth. It doesn't need a lot of consciousness. The specs are saying the minimum viable input is actually quite small. The issue is that it has to be organized, focused, and sustained over time. A single consciousness can sustain it because, she paused, tapping the schematic. Because a single mind can maintain a focused pattern indefinitely without drift. Multiple minds would introduce interference. The frequency would. She stopped. Jogo looked up from his terminal. He had the same expression Rael recognized from every moment before breakthrough, the particular stillness of someone watching a domino fall. Multiple minds drift, Priya said slowly. Right, that's the problem. Multiple consciousness inputs would interfere with each other. Except, she looked at Rael. Except what if the interference was controlled? What if you used multiple minds not in harmony but in a specific structured dissonance, like a chord instead of a note? Rael looked at the specifications again, at the frequency requirements, at the resonance threshold. How many would you need, he said, for a sustained structured chord? Priya was doing math in her head, the way she always did, her eyes going slightly unfocused. With hardware amplification to stabilize the inputs, 6 maybe 8 minds, not sacrificed, not embedded, just focused simultaneously on the same structured pattern, feeding it through a modified resonance emitter to the anchor. A modified from what? From this. She pulled up a section of the Vethkali archive. They have a ceremonial resonance device. It's used in their bonding rituals, the ones that link network-bound Vethkali to the anchor in the first place. It does exactly what we'd need. Takes multiple consciousness inputs and structures them into a single coherent pattern. Do we have one on the station? The Envoy Prime would have one in her kit, Jogo said. It's standard equipment for network-bound officials. Okay. Rael sat back. So we need Sarael Ven's resonance device, and we need 8 people willing to focus their consciousness together into the anchor, long enough to contain Kelvast without anyone dying. In about 28 hours, Priya added. In about 28 hours, he agreed. And the council has to keep running so nobody panics, and we have to figure out how to run this ceremony while also. Yes, Rael said. All of that. Jogo drained his coffee. You know, he said, I thought this summit was going to be boring. Rael went back to Sarael Ven at 3 a.m. with Priya's specifications. He laid them out and waited. She studied them for 7 minutes without speaking. Her bioluminescent patterns ran through slow, complex sequences. The thinking patterns Rael had come to recognize, the ones that looked like clouds building before a storm. The resonance device, she said finally, was not designed for this application. I know. Can it be modified? Possibly. She looked at the specification again. The theoretical framework is not wrong. Multiple consciousness input structuring a cord. It has never been attempted, but the mathematics suggest it could work. The question is whether human consciousness is capable of sustaining the required focus. What's the required focus? The resonance pattern is complex. In the ceremony, the Vethkali who enters the anchor must hold a structured visualization, a specific image that the anchor can read as ordered consciousness. It is not merely concentration. It is, she paused. The best analogy I can offer is that you must feel something with complete sincerity, not just think it. The anchor reads the emotional structure of the thought, not the intellectual content. Rael was quiet. What did you feel? He asked. When you were bonded to the network, she looked at him for a long moment. Her patterns were very slow, very deep blue. I thought of my daughter, she said. She was 6 years old. I held her face in my mind and I felt entirely what it meant that she existed. That was all. That was enough. Then humans can do it, Raelza said. You cannot know. We feel things, he said, not unkindly. Just fine. Getting 8 volunteers was the easy part and the hard part simultaneously. Easy because when Rael explained what was happening, not the full panic version, but the accurate version, the one that included Kelvast and the consumption of inhabited systems, and the fact that the station was sitting on a 2,000-year-old cosmic cage that was about to fail. Everyone he asked said yes immediately, not bravely, not dramatically, just yes, in the way that people said yes to things that needed doing. Hard because there were 240 humans on this station, and he needed 8, and everyone wanted to be one of the 8. He chose Yenna because she was the sharpest mind he'd met in 6 weeks, and because she had the stillness for it. He chose Priya because she understood the technical side and because, as she put it, someone has to make sure this doesn't blow up. He chose Jogo because the man had an almost frightening capacity for focus when a problem had his interest. He chose Staff Sergeant Denny Orikov because she was the best regulated soldier he'd served with and had once described, without irony, spending 3 hours in a sniper's hide by thinking about her grandmother's garden. He chose Korsman Phi Aratau because she had 22 years of field medicine experience and the specific calm of someone who had held many dying things and refused to let go. He chose Petty Officer Second Class Tomas Hale because when Rael had tested the resonance device's preliminary readings, Tomas had scored higher on the coherence index than anyone else by a significant margin, and when asked why, Tomas had shrugged and said, I've been thinking about my dog a lot lately. She passed last year. He chose Engineer First Class Adisa Musa because she had worked on the anchors, systems, and understood them better than anyone except Priya. And he chose himself because it was his station and his call, and because when Sarael Ven had described holding the face of her daughter in her mind and feeling what it meant that she existed, he knew exactly what thought he would hold. He'd known the moment she described it. He would think about Elena Morrow, his sister, 13 years dead. She'd been a planetary rescue worker, and she'd died in a collapse on Heron's world when a structure she'd entered to find survivors had given way beneath her. She'd pulled 4 people out before the floor took her. He thought about her every day. Had for 13 years. It was not always painful anymore. Sometimes it was just present, like a hand on his shoulder, like company in the dark. He thought, if what the anchor needs is organized consciousness, emotion held with complete sincerity, there is nothing more organized in me than this. They had 12 hours left when Kel-Vast first made itself known beyond the anchor chamber. Rail felt it before the instruments registered it. A pressure that wasn't physical, a sense of the air going somehow thinner even though the atmospheric readings were normal. And then the lights in the east corridor flickered once and went out, and when they came back on, they were a different color. Not wrong exactly, just other. The specific amber of early autumn, warm and strange, where the station's cool white had been. And in the engineering bay, Priya called him to say that the resonance variance had jumped. Not 0.003% anymore, 0.04%, and climbing. It's dreaming, she said. The entity. I think it's dreaming before it's fully awake. Captain, some of the crew are. She hesitated. Some of them are having trouble remembering things. Small things. Yenna couldn't remember her quarters number. Jogo forgot how to get to the main corridor. It's like being forgotten, Rail said. Like forgetting yourself. Yeah, the council chamber, mercifully, was insulated. The delegate quarters were in the oldest part of the station, the original Vethkali core, and the old construction apparently still had enough residual anchor resonance to buffer against Kel-Vast early dreaming. But the human quarters, the new sections, the retrofitted arms, they were exposed. His crew was losing themselves, slowly and quietly, in the way that water loses temperature in a cold room. Not dramatically, just leaving. He found 2 of his security details standing in a corridor, looking confused, unable to remember where they'd been going or what their names were. He sat with them for a few minutes and talked to them about nothing, about where they were from, about their families, about small specific details of who they were, and watched the blankness fade and their eyes come back. It was the strangest thing he'd ever done in a crisis, talking someone back to themselves. But it worked. He made a note of that. Sarael Ven modified the resonance device in 4 hours with the help of Priya and Adisa, which was, she told him, a genuinely remarkable pace for work that Vethkali engineers would typically take months to perform. Your engineers think differently than ours, she said, watching Priya and Adisa consult in rapid shorthand over a circuit diagram. You move very fast. We're usually on fire, Rail said. She looked at him. It's an expression, he said. She looked at Priya and Adisa again. They are genuinely not afraid. They're afraid. They're just not letting it stop them. It's a habit. A habit of not dying? A habit of doing the thing anyway. He paused. How's the device? Ready. She set it on the table between them. It was a small thing, not what he'd expected. He'd imagined something ceremonial and imposing, the kind of artifact you'd find in a vault. What she'd set down was about the size of a portable med scanner, matte silver, with subtle Vethkali harmonic patterns engraved along its edges that caught the light and seemed, somehow, to move slightly when you weren't looking directly at them. How does it work? You hold it. All of you, with your hands in contact with the relay panels here and here. She indicated 2 flat sections on each side. It reads your biometric fields and translates the consciousness input into a resonance signal. The anchor does the rest. You hold your structured thought, your feeling, for as long as the anchor needs to reinforce itself. The process takes between 4 and 20 minutes, depending on the strength of the inputs. And we just think something we love. She was quiet for a moment. I want to be precise. It is not merely thinking it. You must be fully in it. The anchor reads authenticity, not performance. If you perform a feeling, it reads the performance. You must arrive at the thing. Go to where it actually lives in you. Hold it there without flinching. Rail nodded. And if it doesn't work, she said, not confrontationally, just clearly, then we go to your protocol. You sacrifice yourself to the anchor, and we contain Kel-Vast the way your people always have. He looked at her steadily. That is the fallback. I'm not removing that option. I just want to try something else first. Why? It was a genuine question. He could see that. She wasn't challenging him. She wanted to understand. Because you have been sacrificing your best people to hold that door for 5,000 years, he said, and I think you're tired. Her bioluminescent patterns ran through that brief golden flicker again, faster this time. She turned away and looked at the wall. Yes, she said, very quietly. We are very tired. They went down to the core chamber at 0300, 9 hours before Kel-Vast would reach full awakening. The core chamber was a place that felt like it had been waiting. Rail had been in a lot of spaces in his 11 years of deep space duty. Dry docks, derelict hulks, alien temples that human explorers had found sealed for 10,000 years. And he'd developed a sense for places that held old things. This was one of those places. The air tasted different here, older, and the walls were the original Vethkali construction, not the retrofitted human sections. and they had a quality of deep, quiet attention, like the walls of a room where important things had always happened. The anchor itself was in the center, a column of quantum latticed crystal 2 meters tall, completely transparent, with something inside it that was not quite light and not quite darkness, something that moved like a slow current in deep water. You could feel it before you saw it. A pressure in the center of your chest, right at the sternum, the kind of pressure you felt when you heard music that meant something to you. Kelvast was moving inside the anchor. Rael could see it. Patterns in the crystal, slow and vast, turning like the arms of something waking from a very long sleep. How long? He asked Priya. She checked the resonance readings. At current rate, maybe 7 hours before it breaches containment. But it's accelerating. Could be 5 hours. He looked at the 8 of them. Yenna was steady, hands loose at her sides. The precise stillness of someone who'd already accepted the situation. Priya had her technical face on, focused, processing. Jogo had his hands in his pockets and was looking at the anchor with pure curiosity. Denny had her eyes closed for a moment, and he suspected she was already in her grandmother's garden. Faye was looking at her hands. Tomas was very still, the specific stillness of someone carrying something they'd learned to carry gently. Adisa was doing systems checks on the device, and Rael was thinking about Elena. He picked up the device. "All right," he said, hands on the relay panels. "Priya will tell you when the connection is stable. When she does, go to your thing. Whatever it is, the person, the place, the moment. Don't perform it. Go there." "Sir," Yenna said, "what do you hold?" He looked at her. "My sister," he said. "She died 13 years ago, pulling people out of a building. I think about her every day. I think about what it means that she was the kind of person who went into a building that was falling." He paused. "I think about the fact that she never hesitated, that she didn't calculate, she just went." Yenna nodded. Her jaw was set. "My daughter is 4 years old," she said. "She learned to ride a bike last month and she fell off 17 times before she stopped counting the falls." "My brother," Priya said. "He's a teacher on Kendrick Station. He teaches 7-year-olds. He's the best person I know." "My grandmother made bread every Sunday," Denny said quietly, without opening her eyes. "The whole house smelled like it. Even when there wasn't any bread. The house just remembered. My crew on the Kepler's Reach," Faye said. "We were adrift for 14 days after the Shearwater incident. 14 days, 4 of them critical, and none of them died. When the rescue ship came, everyone was crying and nobody could explain why. My dog's name was Biscuit," Tomas said. "She was not a smart dog. She was the most loyal creature I have ever known." "My mother," Adisa said. "She worked 4 jobs to get me to engineering school. She came to graduation in shoes that didn't fit because she'd bought them secondhand. And they were the wrong size, and she was not going to miss it." Jogo was quiet for a moment. Then, "My husband sings in the shower, terrible voice. I have listened to it every morning for 23 years and I would give anything to hear it right now." The chamber was very quiet. Sarah Alven was standing at the back, very still, her patterns running deep and slow. She said nothing. "All right," Rael said, "let's hold the door." They placed their hands on the relay panels, and the device came alive with a warmth that wasn't heat. It was something else, something that started in the palms and moved up the arms and settled in the chest. Priya murmured readings. The resonance signal was building. Multiple consciousness inputs, structured and dissonant in the way that chords are dissonant. Not the same note, but organized, held together by the fact that each of them had arrived, completely, at the thing they were holding. Rael went to Elena. Not to the memory of her, to the fact of her. The fact that she had existed, that she had been a person who ran toward falling buildings, that she had died choosing something instead of running from it, that she had given 4 people the rest of their lives. He held that, not as grief, not as pride, as certainty, as the most organized, structured, sincerely felt thing in him. This is true, this happened, this is what humanity is. In the dark, in the cold, in the places where no one is watching, this is what we do. The device hummed. The anchor's crystal began to change. The slow, vast movement of Kelvast inside it, turning, waking, began to slow. Not because it was being suppressed, because the anchor itself was drawing energy, organizing it into the cage structure, reinforcing the lattice that held the entity in its resonance prison. Kelvast pushed back. It was not an attack. It was more like gravity. The quality of the presence in the room deepened, and Rael felt the pressure in his chest intensify into something that was almost pain. And in the corner of his vision, things began to happen that he did not look at directly. Images that weren't his memories. vast cold shapes that moved in the peripheral dark, the specific disorientation of a mind being touched by something that was organized on a scale he couldn't comprehend. He felt Yenna to his left, not physically. The device had some quality of connecting their consciousness at the edges, and she was thinking about her daughter on the bike, falling and getting up, 17 times before she stopped counting the falls. Not because she stopped falling, because she decided the falls didn't matter. He felt Tomas warm and specific, Biscuit asleep at the foot of the bed, that specific weight of unconditional trust. He felt Denny, in a kitchen that smelled like Sunday bread, in a house that kept the memory of it. He felt all of them, a structure of specific, irreducible human things, not grand, not cosmic, not heroic, a dog, a bicycle. A mother in ill-fitting second-hand shoes who was not going to miss graduation. A husband singing badly in a shower. A teacher of 7-year-olds. A girl who went into a falling building and didn't come back. The anchor blazed. Not light, something else. A resonance so deep it was felt rather than seen. A pulse that ran from the crystal through the floor, through the walls, through the entire structure. Of Cassian Gate, a wave of organized consciousness that hit the Kelvast entity like a door slamming shut. Rail heard it, not with his ears, but with whatever sense it was that had smelled the old rain before any of this began. He heard Kelvast, vast and cold and ancient and hungry, reach the boundary of the reinforced anchor and find it, complete, closed, sealed not with sacrifice, but with something it had not encountered in 5,000 years of waking and sleeping and consuming. The specific, irreducible weight of human things, not power, not will, weight, the kind of weight that comes from love that has had to survive. The entity withdrew. It did not disappear. It did not die. It went back to dreaming, slow and deep and far, and the anchor sealed around it with a completeness that Priya, 15 minutes later, would describe as unlike anything in the Veth Kali engineering specifications. Not just reinforced, but restructured. The cage remade into something denser and more complex than the original Veth Kali design. They took their hands off the relay panels. The device went silent. The chamber was very quiet. The smell of old rain was completely gone. The aftermath was administrative before it was anything else, which was how Rail knew things were genuinely okay. Crises had an unmistakable quality of resolution when they ended with paperwork rather than emergency protocols. Priya ran full diagnostics on the anchor for 4 hours. The readings were, she said, unprecedented. The anchor's resonance field was running at 140% of its design capacity, and the pattern structure was different. Not the single-thread consciousness signature of a Veth Kali sacrifice, but something more complex. A chord still sustained, somehow, by the echo of what had been fed into it. It's like it recorded them, she said, a little awed. Like the anchor is carrying the structure of what they held. Not the memories, the shape of them. Rail thought about that. Is it stable? He asked. More stable than it's been in the historical record. I compared it to the Veth Kali archive readings going back 2,000 years. She paused. Captain, this anchor won't need reinforcement for at least 300 years. By my calculations. He looked at the crystal. Inside it, Kelvast was very still and very quiet and very, very far away. Log it all, he said. Start everything. Already started, Yenna said from behind him. He turned. She was standing in the chamber doorway, data pad in hand, making notes. She had the expression of someone who had been through something significant and had decided to be proud of it later and thorough about it now. Good, he said. Sarah Elvin found him in the corridor outside the core chamber at midday, 6 hours after they'd stepped away from the anchor. She was carrying 2 cups of something hot, a Veth Kali preparation, pale and faintly luminescent, that smelled like green tea and something else he couldn't identify. She offered him one. He took it. It tasted like green tea and rain. They stood together in the corridor for a while, not speaking. You were not afraid, she said eventually. Not an accusation, an observation. We were afraid. You did it anyway. Yes, the anchor. She paused. My technical staff reviewed Petty Officer Solano's readings this morning. What you did has never been done. The mathematics exist, but we never attempted it. We did not consider that non-sacrificial reinforcement was possible. Why not? She was quiet for a moment. Because we did not believe that consciousness could be sufficiently organized without the totality of sacrifice. The ceremony requires the entire mind. We assumed that voluntary, focused consciousness given willingly but held by a living person would not be equivalent, that it would be too partial. She paused. Too human, I think. We did not say that, but I believe that is what we thought. Too messy, Rail said. Yes, too incomplete. Too full of noise. The noise is the point, he said. A dog that's not smart, bred on a Sunday. A bad singer in a shower. He looked at the wall. We're not organized in the way you are. We're organized the way rivers are organized. Not precise, but with direction, with weight, with the ability to cut through almost anything given enough time. He paused. You spend 5,000 years sacrificing your best people to hold that door because you were looking for a solution that was clean. We are not clean, but we held it. She was quiet for a long time. There are 37 anchor stations in the Kelveris network, she said finally. I know. Several of them are approaching resonance variance thresholds similar to what Cassian Gate was showing when you arrived. I have not formally reported those readings to the Council because the only known solution requires sacrifices, he said. Yes. Give me the specifications for the other stations, he said. I'll find you 37 teams. She turned to look at him. Her bioluminescent patterns, deep blue, silver, and now that flickering gold, ran through something long and complex. Something he didn't have a translation for, but that felt, whatever it was, like the weather changing. You understand, she said, what this would mean. Humans interfacing with Vethkali anchor technology. Humans holding the containment network. She paused. The Council will have opinions. The Council has opinions about everything we do, he said. We do it anyway. You are, she said slowly, the most irritating species I have encountered in 5,000 years of space travel. I know. You are also, she said after a pause, the most useful. Rael drank the tea that tasted like old rain. The summit concluded 2 days later with the usual ratification of trade, agreements and border protocols. Ambassador Park signed 17 documents and gave 2 speeches and managed, in the reception following the second speech, to orchestrate a joint tasting event between the human, Moranai, and Vethkali delegations that involved 6 types of bread from 6 different planetary traditions, which she had specifically requested from the station galley. The Moranai found this so unexpectedly moving, bread being, apparently, a sacred product in their culture, that the atmosphere in the chamber shifted, and a trade agreement that had been stalled for 3 years was suddenly, inexplicably, possible. Rael watched this from the corridor outside the chamber and thought, there it is again, the thing that makes the security algorithms nervous. It's not violence. It's the completely unpredictable capacity to do something that lands exactly right. Sarah Ven passed him on her way out of the reception. She paused. The specifications, she said, for the other stations. I have transmitted them to your terminal. I saw them come in. Thank you. The first station with an urgent variance reading is Kelmora 7. It is 14 light years from here. She paused. The current network-bound envoy there is named Tariv Shan. She has been the bound for 60 years. She has 3 children. Another pause. She is afraid. Tell her we're coming, Rael said. Sarah Ven looked at him for one long moment with those deep ocean eyes. I already have, she said. 3 weeks later, Rael was back on the Morrow's Ridge. New drive coils, repaired weapons array. His crew returned from leave, sunburned and rested, and louder than he'd remembered. Yenna had brought back coffee from somewhere and was making everyone try it with an evangelical certainty that this was the best cup available anywhere in the Helix corridor. Jogo had brought back a terrible hat that he showed everyone immediately. Priya had 17 new engineering papers she wanted Rael to read, which he would not read. And she knew he would not read, and she shared them anyway on the principle that proximity to good thinking eventually rubbed off. He stood on the bridge of his ship and felt it around him the way you feel a room you've lived in long enough to know in the dark. Course heading, sir? Yenna asked from navigation. Kelmora 7. He sat down in the command chair. We have 36 more doors to hold. 36, sir? It's a long story. I'll brief on the way. He paused. And pull the engineering specifications for the Kelveris network. All of them. I want Priya to start on the anchor reinforcement protocol. She's already started, Yenna said. Of course she had. The Morrow's Ridge pulled away from Callaway Station and pointed her bow at the stars, and Rael Morrow thought about his sister, and about resonance anchors, and about the fact that the Galactic Council's security algorithms had just gained another data point about humans, appearing in unexpected places and doing things no one had planned for. He hoped they were updating their models. The Kelmora 7 operation became the template. He didn't intend it as a template. He intended it as a rescue mission. Get to the station, reinforce the anchor, save the network-bound envoy from 60 years of having one foot in the cage, go home. What it became was the thing that things became when humans touched them. Complicated, then documented, then copied, then improved, then inevitable. Terev Shan was, as Sarael Ven had described, afraid. She met them at the airlock with the carefully composed expression of someone who has been afraid for a very long time and has developed a professional face to wear over it. She was small for a Vethkali, and her bioluminescent patterns ran in tight, controlled loops that Rael had come to recognize as the suppression of something larger. When he explained what they were going to do, she stood completely still for almost 30 seconds. "This has not been done," she said. "It was done 3 weeks ago," he said. "Vethkali engineers have not confirmed." "With respect," Priya said from behind him, "I have 219 pages of data from the Cassian Gate anchor confirming it. I brought copies." Terev Shan looked at the datapad Priya held out, then at Priya, then at Rael. "You brought copies," she said. "She always brings copies," Rael said. "It's one of her best qualities." Terev Shan took the datapad, read for 4 minutes in silence. Then she looked up with an expression that Rael couldn't read. Something complex in the Vethkali range, something he didn't have the pattern vocabulary for yet. "I have 3 children," she said. "I know," he said. "The eldest is a cartographer. She maps the outer reaches of the Vethkali home system. She has found 17 new bodies in the last 2 years, and she names them after things she loves." She paused. "She named one after me." "Tell me about her," Rael said. "Tell me everything you think when you think about her. That's what we'll put into the anchor." Terev Shan's bioluminescent patterns ran gold. All of them, fully for the first time, not a flicker, not a passing moment. Just gold running through her, warm and complete and uncontained. The Galactic Council emergency session was called 6 months later. This was not unexpected. The Council called emergency sessions every time humans did something sufficiently unprecedented. And the systematic, station-by-station reinforcement of the Kelvaris containment network, performed by human volunteers using Vethkali anchor technology, in partnership with increasingly less reluctant Vethkali envoys, documented in exhaustive detail by Priya Solano and shared freely with the Council's Technical Bureau, qualified as sufficiently unprecedented by a considerable margin. Rael attended via long-range comm. He was 11 light-years from the nearest council chamber and he had a schedule. "Captain Morrow," said Council Speaker Yeth Mara, who was a Drev, and therefore delivered their portion of the proceedings from inside an environmental suit that was specifically fitted for podium. "Appearances, this council requires an explanation." "Of which part, Speaker?" "Of all of it." A pause. The translation matrix conveyed something wry in the delivery, which Rael was fairly sure wasn't intended. Specifically, "What authorization did you have for interfacing with Vethkali ancient network infrastructure?" "The Envoy Prime of the Vethkali delegation gave me access to the anchor specifications," he said. "She had the authority to do so as a network-bound official. Everything was documented. And the subsequent operations at Kelmora 7, the Vethkali relay station Shanteva, and the 3 stations in the outer corridor, also authorized, also documented. The documentation is available." "We have the documentation." Another pause. "Captain, you understand that the Kelvaris network is Vethkali property and has been for 5,000 years. I understand that the Kelvaris network contains 37 anchors holding an entity capable of consuming inhabited systems," Rael said, "and that the Vethkalali have been sacrificing their best people to maintain those anchors for 5,000 years, and that there is now a non-sacrificial alternative that is working at 100% of required efficacy at every station where it has been applied. Speaker, I respectfully submit that the question of property rights is somewhat secondary to the question of whether the entity gets out." There was a pause, then another. These pauses, Rael had learned, meant the council was conferring privately in channels he wasn't connected to. Ambassador Park's face appeared in the corner of his comm screen. She had the expression she wore when she was trying not to smile and mostly succeeding. She gave him a small, precise nod. He waited. "The council," said Speaker Yethmera, "acknowledges the efficacy of the human intervention and authorizes continuation under a joint Vethkali human technical oversight framework, the terms of which will be negotiated in the next standard session." "Thank you, Speaker." "Captain." A pause. "The Vethkali delegation has requested that a formal commendation be entered into the council record on behalf of you and your crew. They've described the human contribution as—" A longer pause. He suspected the speaker was reading from notes. "An act of irreplaceable courage and unexpected kindness for which the Vethkali people will be grateful in all the years they have remaining, which may now be considerably more than they had previously believed." Rael was quiet for a moment. "Tell them," he said, that it was the least we could do. Sarah Ven was waiting when he returned to Cassian Gate for the Oversight Framework negotiations 6 weeks later. She was standing at the airlock when his shuttle docked, which was not, he had come to understand, a gesture Veth Kali made casually. Coming to the airlock meant something. It was the kind of gesture you made for things and people that mattered. She was carrying 2 cups of the pale, luminescent tea. "The negotiations begin tomorrow," she said, handing him one. "I know." He took it. It tasted, as always, like green tea and old rain. "How's the anchor?" she said. "Perfectly stable. The Engineering Bureau has finished their analysis of the Cassian Gate readings. They have concluded that your team's reinforcement introduced a structural complexity to the anchor lattice that was not present in the original design, that the multi-consciousness cord approach actually improves the containment beyond its baseline." She paused. "There is some debate among the older engineers about whether this is an achievement or an embarrassment." "Why embarrassment?" "Because it implies that in 5,000 years of sacrificing our best people to a necessary problem, there was another solution available all along that we did not consider because we had never met the species capable of providing it." She looked at him. "It is a difficult thing to be proud of a discovery and humbled by it simultaneously." "That's what discovery is," he said. They walked toward the station's interior together. The corridor was the same amber light it had been in the days when Kelvast was waking, that strange, warm other light that had briefly replaced the station's standard white. Rael had asked the station maintenance crew to keep it. Something about it was right. Something about the color of something changed. "The negotiations," Sarah Ven said. "They will be complex. The Council has many opinions about the extent of human access to ancient network infrastructure. There are member species who are not comfortable with the pace at which humans—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "Integrate. I know. You make them nervous. We make everyone nervous. We've been told." He paused. "We make the algorithms nervous." "The algorithms are not wrong," she said. "Wherever humans appear in large numbers, unexpected things happen. That's going to keep being true," he said. "I can't help you with that." "I did not say it was a problem to be solved," she said. "I said it made them nervous. Those are different things." She paused. "In my experience, the things that make you nervous are often the things most worth paying attention to." He thought about that. They walked on through the amber light of a station that had been changed by what it had held, and outside the transparent observation panels, the stars ran their ancient courses, and somewhere in the deep crystalline dark of the core chamber, Kelvast slept its long dreaming sleep, held in its ancient cage by the echoed weight of small human things: a dog, a bicycle, a Sunday kitchen, a bad singer, a falling building, a woman who had made it to graduation in shoes that didn't fit. Rael Morrow thought about his sister. He thought she would have found all of this very funny, and also completely reasonable, and also the only right thing to do. She would have gone into the chamber first. She always went in first. That was the thing about her. That was the thing about all of them who ran toward the places that were falling. Not because they weren't afraid, because fear had never, not once, been the thing that decided. That was what the anchor had read. That was what had held the door. 3 years later, Rael stood at the 37th station, the last of the Kelveris anchors, deep in the outer reaches of the Fourth Arm. A station so old it had no human name, and the Veth Kali called it simply the first, and placed his hands on the relay panel for the last time. His crew was with him. Not the original 8, although Priya was there, would always be there, datapad in hand, 300 pages of documentation already prepared. Not just his crew. There were 12 humans at this anchor, and 8 Veth Kali, including Sariel Ven, standing at the back with her patterns running that full, sustained gold, and 2 Moronai engineers who had, to general surprise, turned out to be excellent anchor reinforcement practitioners, and 1 Isin who had been very old for longer than anyone could calculate, and who had simply walked in, taken their place at the relay panel, and said nothing, which everyone took as sufficient. The network-bound envoy at the first was the oldest living Veth Kali in the records, 700 years old, a figure of myth and legend in their culture, who had been bound to this anchor for longer than most council member species had spaceflight. She stood very still and very straight, and her bioluminescent patterns were a color that Rael had never seen before, something beyond gold, something that had no human color analog, something that might charitably be described as the visual equivalent of a very long breath finally released. When Rael had explained, as he always explained, she had said only, "What do you hold?" And he had told her. Not just Elena. All of it, Elena and the stations and the crews and Sarah Ven's gold-lit patterns and Terev Shan's daughter who named moons after things she loved and the dog who wasn't smart and the bad singer in the shower and the taste of Sunday bread and the bicycle and the 17 falls and the woman in second-hand shoes and every human who had ever walked into a place that was falling and chosen to hold the door. He held all of that. The device hummed. The anchor blazed. Kelvast withdrew, deep and final, into its long, dreaming dark. And the first anchor, the oldest in the network, the one that had held longer than any other, that had consumed more sacrifices than any other, that had been the first cage built by the first species to encounter the first cosmic dark they didn't know how to fight, became, at last, entirely still. Priya's readings when she checked them were so stable they didn't fit on a standard scale. She stared at the numbers for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up. "Captain," she said. "Yeah? I think we're done." He took his hands off the panel, stood up, looked at the crystal column, Kelvast sleeping in its deep and permanent dark, the anchor holding with the weight of everything small and specific and irreducibly true that humans had ever loved. "Log it," he said. "Already done." Yenna said from behind him. He turned. She was standing in the chamber doorway with her datapad and her coffee and her expression of someone who had helped hold the world up and was quietly and permanently proud of it. He looked at Sarah Ven. She was standing with her patterns running their gold, sustained and complete, and she looked at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Then the council," she said, "will have opinions about this. I know. There are 37 secured anchors. The containment network is complete. There are 17 species that now know what humans are capable of when given access to something they decided to protect." She paused. "The galaxy will not look at humanity the same way after this." "Good," Rael said. She looked at him. "Good?" she said. "They've been looking at us like we're a footnote," he said. 40 years in the council, newest species in the room. The ones the algorithms flag. The ones who make everything complicated and unpredictable." He paused. "Let them look at us differently. That's fine. We were never trying to be predictable. We were trying to be useful." Her bioluminescent patterns were running gold, all gold, without interruption, without flicker, fully, permanently, as naturally as breathing. "You are," she said, "the most useful species I have ever known." "We try," he said. They walked out of the first together, through corridors that were very old and had seen very much. And behind them the anchor held its door, and inside the cage the dreaming dark slept its long unending sleep, and the stars went on as they always had, ancient and indifferent and full of things that humanity had not yet discovered, had not yet decided to protect, had not yet run toward with everything they had, and everything they loved, and everything they refused to let go. There were 36 more hours until the debriefing. Rael spent them thinking about Elena. He always did. He filed the 37th anchor report at 0700, 2 weeks after the first, sitting at the small desk in his quarters aboard the Morrow's Ridge, with his coffee going cold beside him. The report was 142 pages, Priya's doing, and contained, among other things, full resonance data from all 37 anchor operations, comparative analysis of pre- and post-reinforcement stability metrics, complete documentation of the modified Vethkali resonance ceremony protocol as adapted for multi-species application, records of 12 contributing human consciousness inputs across all operations, records of 8 contributing Vethkali inputs, 2 Moronai inputs, 1 Isan input, and a technical appendix covering the quantum lattice structural changes the cord reinforcement method had produced in every anchor it had touched. At the back of the report, after all the technical documentation, Priya had included an appendix she'd titled simply, "The Things They Held." It was not technical data. It was transcribed accounts, not the consciousness inputs themselves, which were felt and not verbal, but what each participant had described afterward in plain language. What they'd gone to, what they'd found, what had been real enough, organized enough, weighted enough to hold the door. A dog named Biscuit who was not smart and absolutely was loyal. A grandmother's bread that a house remembered long after the bread was gone. A husband's terrible singing. 23 years of it, every morning. A mother in second-hand shoes at a graduation she was not going to miss. A 4-year-old on a bicycle who fell 17 times and stopped counting. The falls. A brother who taught 7-year-olds and was the best person anyone knew. The specific irreplaceable weight of a crew that came back alive from 14 days adrift. A cartographer who named moons after things she loved, and named one for her mother. And the one Rael had submitted, In the field for personal notes without elaboration, Elena. She went in first. She always went in first. The Council Technical Bureau had flagged this appendix as non-standard data and requested that it be removed from the official filing. Priya had responded to that request with a 5-page technical argument for why the emotional data was, in fact, the most important technical finding in the entire report, that the anchor's resonance improvement directly correlated with the authenticity and structural complexity of the consciousness inputs, and that the emotional content was not incidental to the anchoring process but fundamental to it, and that removing it from the technical record would be the equivalent of removing the load-bearing wall from a building and hoping the ceiling didn't. Notice, the Council Technical Bureau had not responded. The appendix remained. Rail read it through once, sitting in his quarters with his cold coffee and the familiar hum of his ship around him, the deep space dark outside his viewport full of stars that went on further than any of them could calculate. Then he closed the report, finished the cold coffee, and went to the bridge. "Course heading, sir?" Yenna asked. "Anywhere we're needed," he said. She pulled up the long-range scan feed. 37 anchors, all running clean. The Kelveris network, fully secured for the first time in recorded history. The helix corridor stable, the transit lanes running smooth, the ancient cages holding their ancient dreaming dark. The galaxy was not safe. The galaxy had never been safe. The galaxy was vast and cold, and full of things that had been sleeping for longer than civilization had existed. Things that woke when you cut down old trees and disturbed old beacons, and forgot that the past was still present in ways you hadn't mapped yet. But the doors were held. And when the next one needed holding, humanity would be there, hands on the panel, thinking of the specific, irreducible people they loved. The dogs and the bicycles and the Sunday bread and the bad singers and the women in ill-fitting shoes. Not because it was heroic, not because the galaxy had asked, not because the algorithms had predicted it or the council had authorized it or anyone had planned for humans to be the ones standing at the threshold when the dark pressed close. But because that was what they were. That was what they had always been. Small, loud, chaotic, running the algorithms nervous, making things complicated, going into buildings that were falling, holding things that shouldn't be holdable, going in first, always going in first. Tomorrow's Ridge found her heading and flew. In the months that followed the completion of the Kelveris network reinforcement, the Council's Technical Bureau produced a 109-page analysis of the Cassian Gate incident and its sequels. It was, as Rail was told by Ambassador Park, the most read document in Council circulation in 20 years. The Bureau's report concluded, cautiously, with 11 caveats and 3 dissenting opinions, that the human cord reinforcement method had produced anchor stability results that exceeded the theoretical maximum outlined in the original Vethkali design specifications. The dissenting opinions focused primarily on the question of replicability. Could it be that the results were anomalous? Could it be that the emotional intensity of the first operation, the urgency of the crisis, the proximity of sacrifice, had produced inputs that could not be reliably reproduced under more ordinary circumstances? The Council Tech Bureau set up a replication study to answer this question. They invited human volunteers from civilian populations rather than military crews. They chose people who had no particular training, no crisis to sharpen them, no looming catastrophe to push them toward sincerity. Ordinary people, a baker, a schoolteacher, a retired hydroponics farmer from Kepler's world, a transit worker, a young woman who designed weather prediction models for agricultural use. They ran the ceremony protocol on an anchor that didn't need reinforcement, a controlled test, safety margins everywhere, the entity quiet and distant, no emergency. The results were, if anything, better than Cassian Gate, not by a small margin, by a measurable, reproducible, statistically significant margin. The dissenting authors filed a supplemental note withdrawing their objections. Priya put this supplemental note in a frame above her workstation. She had it printed on actual physical paper, which was a significant commitment given how expensive paper was at the deep space stations where she spent most of her time. Rail asked her once why she'd gone to the trouble. "Because," she said, "I want to be able to look at it every day." Scientists admitting they were wrong about something important. It doesn't happen that often. It should be celebrated when it does. He thought about that for a long time. The Vethkali engineering community had a more complicated reaction. There was, as Sarel Ven had predicted, a sustained and sometimes heated internal debate about what it meant that a solution had existed for 5,000 years and been missed. What it said about the limits of a civilization's thinking when the civilization had no outside perspective to challenge its assumptions. What it cost, over 5 millennia, to sacrifice the network bound rather than finding another way. This debate, Rael was told, was not comfortable. It was not meant to be. The Vethkali had a saying. He'd learned it from Sarel Ven, who used it with a kind of rueful honesty that translated, roughly, as, the things you have always done are invisible until the moment you can no longer do them, and by then the cost has already been paid. They were paying the accounting now, 5,000 years of it, and the accounting, everyone agreed, was necessary. What surprised Rael, what he had not expected when he'd walked into the core chamber of Cassian Gate with a data pad full of Vethkali engineering, archives and a fairly stubborn disinclination to let Sarel Ven sacrifice herself, was how the rest of the council responded, not the Vethkali. He'd understood more or less how that would go, but the others. The Chelak sent a formal communique to the human delegation 6 weeks after the first operation. It was not a long document. It said in Chelak formal register that the translation matrix rendered as ceremonially precise and slightly archaic. We have observed what humans did with the Kelvaris network. We note that they were not asked to do it. We note that they did it anyway. We note that the network now holds. We have a network of our own. It is not the same kind of network, but some of our doors need holding too. The Morinai added a rider to their pending trade agreement with the human delegation. The rider was unusual because it had nothing to do with trade. It said, through several layers of olfactory to linguistic translation that never quite captured all the nuance. We have been watching humans for 40 years, and we have been trying to understand what they are. We think we understand now. They are the species that stays. Everything gets hard and they stay. We find this beautiful and strange, and we wanted to say so because we thought they might not know anyone was watching. The Isin sent nothing. But the ancient being who had walked into the first chamber and placed their hands on the relay panel without being asked had, before leaving, done something that no Isin had been recorded doing in 300 years of council membership. They had stopped and turned back and said one thing. The translation matrix rendered it as, I have been alive a very long time, and I have watched many species make choices when the choices were hard. I did not think I would see something new. I was wrong. Then they had left. Rael read these documents on the morrow's ridge, one after another, over the course of a long transit between stations. He read them the way he read everything important, carefully, without haste, the same way he'd read the Kelvaris engineering archives in a crisis with 3 of the most competent engineers he knew, finding the thing inside the thing. He thought, 40 years of council membership, newest species in the room, still the ones the security algorithms flag. Still the ones who make everything complicated and unpredictable. Still the ones who organize impromptu eating contests with sacred food by accident and somehow end with a trade agreement. Still the ones who walk into falling buildings. He thought, maybe the algorithms aren't tracking the right variable. He'd been thinking, when he walked into that core chamber with his hands about to touch the relay panel, about whether it would work, about the physics of it, about whether human consciousness, structured in a cord, could actually hold an entity that had unmade 6 inhabited systems. What he had not been thinking about was how it would look, what anyone would conclude from it, what the galaxy would decide humanity was. In the aftermath, now that the anchors held and the network was complete and the ancient cage was sealed, and the dreaming dark slept quiet and far, that hadn't been the point. The point had been Sarel Ven, standing in a corridor at midnight with her patterns going dark and then returning, subdued and close, saying we are very tired. The point had been that she was 3 meters tall and 5,000 years old in her civilization's memory, and she had been carrying something that she should not have had to carry alone. The point was the same thing it always was. In the falling buildings and the 14-day drifts and the 17 times and the second-hand shoes. You do not calculate whether it is worth it. You do not wait to be asked. You go to the door. You hold it. You let the galaxy be surprised if the galaxy wants to be surprised. The Morrow's Ridge crossed the transit lane at the edge of the Chelak outer systems 12 days later, and Rael sent a formal response to the Chelak communique. It was brief. It said, tell us about your network. We're listening. He sent a copy to Sarel Ven with a note that said only, you were right about one thing. The galaxy will not look at us the same way. She replied 12 hours later. Her message was short. It said, I was right about one thing. You were right about everything else. And then, because she was Vethkali and 5,000 years of civilization had not, apparently, entirely suppressed the capacity for something like humor. You are still the most irritating species I have encountered. This has not changed. It will not change. I find that I am grateful for it. He read that on the bridge with Yenna standing behind him, reading the navigation feed, and Priya somewhere in the engineering section doing something complicated to the resonance data, and Jogo on comms wearing his terrible hat. He thought about Elena. He thought she would have found this so funny. She would have found it so funny and so right. She would have gone in first. She always did. He looked out the viewport at the stars, ancient, indifferent, vast, and full of things that needed holding. And he thought, we are here. We will keep being here. We are small and loud, and we run the algorithms nervous, and we make everything complicated. And we go in first. That is who we are. That is all we have ever been. And in the deep crystalline dark of the First and Kelmora 7 and Cassian Gate and every anchor in between, the dreaming dark slept on, held in cages that were stronger now than they had ever been, holding because small human things had weight enough to hold the oldest dark in the galaxy. And the weight of them did not diminish, and would not diminish, and would not be forgotten, for 300 years at least, and probably much longer. Probably forever. Biscuit would have liked that. The Morrow's Ridge flew on into the dark, carrying her crew of irritating, predictable, impossibly stubborn humans toward whatever needed holding next. The stars watched, as stars always had, and the galaxy very slowly began to understand. The Chelak network was different from the Kelvaris in almost every technical respect. Different species, different cosmology, different ancient engineering principles, but it was the same in the one way that mattered. Something old had been built to hold something older, and the old was beginning to fail, and the something older was beginning to stir, and every time it stirred, something had to be spent to push it back. The Chelak equivalent of a network-bound envoy was called, in their language, a throne-bearer. There were 4 of them, and they had been throne-bearers for as long as the Chelak kept records, and the records were long. They met Rael at the airlock of Chelak Prime Station 7, a massive structure in the inner edge of the Chelak system, not a transit station but a permanent installation, part fortress and part archive, and they were the most imposing things he'd stood in front of, since Admiral Bren had called him into her office after the Redgate engagement to explain why he'd sacrificed the port weapons array. They were tall by human standards but compact for Chelak, 6-limbed, with the outer limbs folded in the formal configuration that indicated ceremony, and their chitinous plating was old in a way that you could see, the way you could see age in stone. Not deterioration but density. The accumulation of time made visible. The senior throne-bearer was called Kethvar. She had been throne-bearer for, as near as translation could render it, 87 years. She looked at Rael the way stone looks at rain. Not dismissive, just ancient and assessing, measuring. You held the Kelvaris network, she said. My crew held it, he said. I was one of 8. The documents say you conceived the method. Priya Solano conceived the method. I brought her the problem. Kethvar looked at him for a long moment. You deflect credit, she said. I distribute it accurately, he said. Her outer limbs unfolded slightly. The Chelak equivalent, Rael, had been briefed of a slight relaxation. Not a smile. Something more structural than that. Come, she said. We will show you the Tethkaras, our network, our problem. The Tethkaras was older than the Kelvaris. Older, the Chelak record suggested, than the Vethkali civilization. It had been there before either species had starships, and the Chelak had not built it. They had found it in the deep past, already there, already humming, already containing something they did not have a name for and did not at first understand. They had learned to maintain it the way you learn to maintain something that existed before you and would exist after you, with care and caution and a low-level persistent dread that the throne-bearers bore so that the rest of the civilization did not have to. The Chelak equivalent of the anchor was not a crystal column. It was a series of interlocking rings, 12 of them, each 3 meters in diameter, made of something that was not quite metal and not quite stone, suspended in a chamber that was genuinely cold, cold enough that Rael's breath fogged the moment he entered, cold enough that the ancient engineering materials that made up the rings had taken on a faint, permanent frost. The rings were turning, slowly, not mechanically. The movement was too organic for that, too variable. They turned the way water moved in a current, responding to something rather than being driven. And inside the rings, in the space where all 12 axes intersected, Rael felt it before he saw it. The same pressure in the chest, the same quality of presence, the same sense of something vast and very old and fundamentally not local to any single point in space. Different from Kelvast, not the same entity, but recognizable as the same kind of thing, the same category of vast, the same weight of ancient. What do you call it? Rael asked. The name is in a language we do not speak anymore, Kethvar said. The translation is something like, the weight that lived before weight had anything to push against. Rael looked at the rings turning in the cold. And the variance? He asked. Increasing, she said, for 11 years, slowly at first, now faster. She paused. We have 3 throne bearers who have reached the limit of what they can sustain alone. They are. She paused again. And in the pause there was something that the translation matrix rendered as carefully neutral, but that Rael heard clearly as loss. They are diminished. They have given too much for too long. They are still alive, but they are living in winter, Rael said. She looked at him. A Vethkali phrase, he said, from their records, for what happens to the ones who hold too long. Yes, Kethvar said. That is the word for it. She was quiet. We do not like to say it. It feels like defeat. It isn't defeat, Rael said. It's evidence that you never stopped trying to hold it. It's what carrying something looks like from the outside. He looked at the rings. Tell me about your rings. Tell me how the Tethkaris works. I need everything you have. Historical records, engineering documentation, maintenance logs, the ceremony protocols, everything. Why? He looked at her. Because you've been carrying this alone for long enough, he said, and I have a very good engineer. Priya's voice came through his earpiece from the station's observation level, where she'd been allowed to set up her equipment. She had been scanning the Tethkaris rings for 20 minutes with the expression of someone who had been handed the most interesting problem of their professional life. Captain, she said, you are going to want to see these resonance readings. This is completely different from the Kelvaris system. It's running on a different quantum lattice principle, but there are structural analogs, and I think. She paused, the pause of someone doing several calculations simultaneously. I think we can work with this. Kethvar looked up at the observation level, then back at Rael. She has been scanning for 20 minutes, she said. That's enough time for her to have formed a preliminary theory, he said. Give her 3 hours and she'll have a protocol. And you will have volunteers. I always have volunteers, he said. It was not a boast. It was simply true. And he said it simply, and Kethvar heard in it whatever she needed to hear, because her outer limbs unfolded the rest of the way. The throne bearers, she said, have been carrying this for 87 years. In my case, some of the others, longer. She looked at the rings. I have a daughter. She is training to be a throne bearer in her turn. I have tried to be proud of this. Are you? I am proud of her, she said. I am not proud that the institution requires her, that it will cost her, that the cost is. She paused. Has always been tell me about her, Rael said. Tell me what you think when you think about her, the specific things. Kethvar looked at him, her eyes, compound, amber, very old, were steady on his face. Why? Because that's what goes into the anchor, he said. The specific irreducible things, the stuff that can't be generalized. That's where the weight comes from. He paused. The anchor doesn't need power, it needs truth, and the truest things are always specific. She was quiet for a very long moment. Her name, she said slowly, is Kethvari. She is named for me in the tradition of our house. She is 41 years old. She has her father's coloring, lighter than mine, almost translucent at the joints. She learned to read when she was 3. She paused. She reads too fast. She has always read too fast. She goes through the text so quickly she sometimes misses things, and she has to go back, and she is never patient with herself when she has to go back. She thinks going back means she failed. Does she? No, Kethvar said. Going back means she is thorough. Going back is the best thing she does. Her outer limbs flexed. I have tried to tell her this. She doesn't believe me yet. She will. Rael held that. Good, he said. Hold that, exactly that. He looked at the rings. When the time comes, that's what you give it, not the big things. That Kethvar was silent for a moment. Then, in a register that the translation matrix flagged as significant and rendered with unusual care. Humans, she said, are very strange. I know, he said. You are also, she said, very welcome here. He looked at the rings turning in the cold and thought about Elena, and about Kethvari reading too fast and going back, and about all the things that were specific and irreducible and true, and he thought, this is what we are for. Not the grand gestures, not the victories, the specific true things brought to the places where the dark presses close, held there with both hands, held until they hold. He thought about his sister going into the falling building. She hadn't thought about the grand arc of it. She hadn't thought about legacy or significance, or what the galaxy would remember. She'd thought about the people inside. Specific people. People who needed someone to come through the door. She'd gone through the door. He was going through the door. He was always going through the door. His crew was behind him, all the way back. Priya in the observation level, running calculations with her hair coming loose from its tie. Yenna taking logs with her quiet methodical thoroughness. Jogo with his terrible hat and his coffee and his complete willingness to hold strange alien resonance anchors at 0 dark 30. Because the problem was interesting and someone needed to, and there he was. The Moros Ridge was in dock. The Teth Karis was humming in its rings. The ancient weight that had lived before weight had anything to push against was pressing, slow and vast, against a cage that 87 years of sacrifice had kept sealed at considerable cost to the people who had done the keeping. Rael Morrow was a captain of 11 years, a destroyer commander, a person who had destroyed his own ship's port, weapons array stopping a pirate, swarm, and been yelled at for it, and done the right thing anyway. A person who had held an ancient cosmic entity in its cage, with a thought about his dead sister and a handful of ordinary human love. A person who was very good at reading engineering manuals at 1 a.m. and very bad at staying where he was assigned, and very certain, with the certainty of someone who had put their hands on the panel and felt what was on the other side, that this was not finished. Not the Chelak network, not the 5 other ancient containment systems that Sorel Ven's archival research had identified in the 6 months since the first. Not whatever else was out there, dreaming in the dark of the deep arm, held by cages that were older than civilization and maintained by species that had been carrying the weight alone for longer than anyone should have. To carry anything. None of it was finished, but they would get to it. One door at a time, one hand on the panel, one specific, irreducible, genuinely felt true thing. One entrance into a place that was falling, always first. That was the only way it ever got done.